Alright, let's move on to the cleanup section. Here, our objectives are going to be to remove any isolated distracting elements and/or any small texture that is distracting. The tools we'll be using are the healing brush, the clone stamp, and the paintbrush. So first off, let's briefly discuss the benefits of each of these tools. The clone stamp is a copy-paste, what you see is what you get tool. So what that means is we sample from one spot and paint in another. And once again, it is what you see is what you get. So an exact one-to-one copy-paste. Now, the healing brush tool is a smart tool version of the clone stamp tool. So it is still a copy-paste tool, still a sample and paint. So we sample and then we paint. However, thanks to its smart tool nature, it will try to guesstimate what the perfect exposure and color of the painted area will be based on its surroundings. So for example, if I come in with the clone stamp and I try to sample from a darker area to a lighter area, that's not really going to work. Meanwhile, with the smart tool version, the healing brush, we can sample from a darker area and paint onto a lighter area, and it will automatically adjust to the surroundings of the painted area. Lastly, we're also going to be using the paintbrush for some very minor fixes. And this only works on a very small scale level, so really on like a pixel level for tiny details, because we don't have any texture coming in with this paintbrush as we do with the clone stamp and the healing brush. So let's get started. For the cleanup section, I would definitely recommend working with a tablet, as this will heavily speed up your workflow. I would also recommend working on a new layer instead of the background layer or even a copy of the background layer. This gives us a lot more control, as it permits us to do things such as erase adjustments or mask them and so on. The most important thing when working in this non-destructive way is to set both your healing brush and the clone stamp to sample current and below. If it is set to sample current layer, it will sample from this blank layer, which of course includes no information. Meanwhile, current and below means that it will sample from that underlying layer. We can make our changes, and then once again, we have full flexibility in terms of erasing or masking, and even making changes to the background layer. So I like to start off with the healing brush. It is the quickest tool, as it does the most work for us since it's a smart tool, so I try to do as much as I can with the healing brush and then resort to the clone stamp and the paintbrush as a backup. Let's dial in our brush settings first. I keep my hardness for both the clone stamp and the healing brush around 10 to 15%, and then the size will adjust based on what I'm trying to remove. As I mentioned, the sample needs to be set to current and below, and generally people set their diffusion anywhere between 3 and 5. I keep mine at 4. The last setting that I find to be really important is to make sure that your aligned box is checked, and this will heavily cut down on your workflow. When aligned is off, and you sample a point by pressing and holding Alt or Option and clicking, that point will be permanently selected. So if you do a brush stroke and then do a new brush stroke and another one, no matter how many you do, it will keep sampling from that same sample point. Meanwhile, if we check the aligned box, the sample point will move in parallel to the paint point even when we start a new brush stroke. As you can see, this means that we can very quickly and efficiently move through areas without having to continuously resample, as long as the distance between the sample point and the paint point is effective. Okay, so now that we've dialed in our brush settings, let's move through here. I'm just going to start at the chin and move upwards through the skin, and I'll see where I encounter any sort of small-scale problems, either in the texture or with any sort of isolated elements that need to be removed. It's extremely important to keep your brush size the size of whatever element you're actually removing. If you go too large on your brush, you're losing unnecessary detail and doing unnecessary damage, right? So try to keep it as small as possible. So here we're going for a couple of specks in the skin that might be distracting later. These are not exactly things that we want to remove with dodge and burn. Also going to remove a couple of these little wrinkles that could be distracting, and some of these makeup specks. Let's move on to the other side. Over here we have a small blemish, and then we also have this hair, And that's going to lead us to a pretty convoluted area right around here that we're going to try to sort of fix. Let's see if there's anything else over here. Have a couple of small specks. Any areas that are, distractingly bright or dark. If we have any pores or any spots that we want to paint out. And fortunately, seeing this all in color also makes it very easy for us to see whether something is a freckle or not. So that brings me to a very important question, which is what should we really be removing and what should we be keeping? Now, this is very subjective. Generally, the rule of thumb that I try to go by is if it'll still be there in a month, I keep it. So that includes, defining scars or freckles or anything of the sort. Meanwhile, if it's a small or temporary scar or a blemish or something else of the sort, then I try to remove it. If there's something that you're unsure about, you can always just go ahead and ask the model. Send her a quick screenshot and ask her, hey, should I remove this or keep it? Generally, I'd always say better safe than sorry. We can also do a little bit of cleanup on the lips if there are any sort of spots that super stand out in terms of brightness or darkness. These are going to be very difficult to remove with dodge and burn, so instead we can sort of carefully try to come in and remove those with a healing brush. Let's take a look at our progress so far in the lower half of the face. Here's our before and here's the after. Before, after. Let's continue to move on to the top of the face. In this case, I'll finish the skin first and then go to the detail work of the eyes. Up here we have a couple of stray hairs, and once again I'm attacking them with a brush that is exactly the size of whichever hair I'm removing. Now, removing these is totally optional and once again a very subjective choice. You might want to keep them, you might want to leave them, it's really totally up to you. Sometimes a spot just doesn't quite look right, so in that case we might have to resample and try a different sampling point. Okay, I'm going to choose to leave a couple of these hairs around the edge of the face. I think they look nice and natural, especially because Keep's hair is curly, so that's how the hair would naturally fall in her face. I just removed the ones that were distracting me towards the center of the forehead. Okay, moving on to this very sort of complex and convoluted area around the eyes and the eyebrows. First, I'll see if there are any other skin problems that I can fix around here, as those will be the simplest ones. I can also paint out a couple of stray eyebrow hairs and fix the eyebrows a tiny bit if there are any light or dark specks on them. Now, around the eyes themselves, the cleanup is extremely important, as these are often the most central part of our portrait and where we are ultimately trying to attract attention to. So having the eyes look balanced and clean is really important as not to distract from their beauty and integrity. Here, I'm going to try to tackle these distracting hairs around here, and I'll mostly be able to do that with a healing brush, although some of them I might have to remove with the clone stamp and or even with a paintbrush. So let's see how far we get with a healing brush. Once again, what makes this much easier is to work with as small of a brush as possible. This is about as far as I can go with the healing brush. I've really removed most here, and then we're left with a couple of weird little aberrations and dark spots, which is okay. We can clean that up with dodge and burn if it's bothering us. Now, lastly, we do still have these two hairs running across these very convoluted areas. Here, I would say let's get started with the clone stamp. And let's use that to go in with a bit more detail work. And we can bump up the flow anywhere around 10 to 30% for this. The important thing here is, of course, just to sample from as close to the final painting point as possible, because otherwise the brightness will deviate too much. So the last couple of issues I want to solve around here, I'm going to tackle with the paintbrush. I generally like to set it to anything around 10 to 30% here in terms of the flow, and then I keep my hardness at 0 and I adjust my size based on what I'm working on. Now there are a couple of things here that we can tackle. There are a few such as these clumps in the eyelashes that we really can't fix with the clone stamp or healing brush, but we can carefully just tackle them with a very fine and small paintbrush. All I'm doing in this case is just sampling the skin tone next to the eyelash and removing the clump from the eyelash by painting over it very carefully. We also have this stray hair running across the eyelashes, which of course would be impossible to fix with the clone stamp or healing brush. So what we can do is sort of carefully trace over the eyelashes by sampling an eyelash color with a paintbrush and just running along those lash shapes. Okay, let's check around the eyes and see if the makeup needs any other help. For example, the eyeliner is a little bit messy. Here you can kind of see how Keep's lash line runs, and then suddenly we have this eyeliner that sort of appears right around here and comes out into this winged shape, but it's all a little bit messy. Now I would like this to be a little bit more continuous and flow nicer with the natural shape of her eyes. To do this, I'm going to sample one of the points in this eyeliner. So that's going to be this, very dark, almost black brown color. And I'll come in with a flow of maybe around 20% and work to fill in these little white gaps. Generally, what I'm trying to create is more of a shape that continues this eyeliner up here more consistently and smoothly. So essentially, we're just missing a little patch right around here, and I'm going to fill that in. Now, in terms of makeup education, I would highly, highly, highly recommend for you to check out a couple of YouTube tutorials if you don't know anything about makeup and how it creates flattering shapes around the eyes or the face. This is a really good investment of your time, as often makeup can use a little bit of help. Down here, I'm also going to smooth out this winged eyeliner shape a little bit. So I'm just going to take a look at these edges. Again, I don't want to come in super thick and just, Sharpie that on. I want to work very carefully as we don't have any texture along with this brush. This is just a straight up brush. So we only want to fill in the little gaps so that we maintain a natural look. Okay, let's take a look at the before and after for that. So as you can see, that has really, really cleaned up this eyeliner and really smoothed out the eye shape along with it. Let's take a look from a little further away. Okay, so much cleaner and more consistent. We can do the same thing for the eyebrows. Once again, I would recommend a little bit of education before starting to paint in random brow hairs. In this case, we don't really need to, but I'm going to add some just for the sake of demonstrating it. The most important thing is to sort of match about how wide and how dark the brow hairs are. So in this case, I'll dial my flow back even further and go a little bit thicker on the hairs and carefully paint those in with some soft brush strokes. Let's go ahead and do the cleanup on the other eye. Fortunately, here we have a lot less of a mess coming around this side, so we really only need to focus on the eye itself. Back to the healing brush, I'm cleaning up any of the little eyelashes that are coming inside the eye. They don't really belong there. Sometimes if the model has red veins inside her eyes and they're very prominent, those can also be painted out, but that is, also a subjective decision. And then the same goes for any stray eyebrow hairs. You can clean those up or you can keep them. Sometimes it's actually a part of the model's aesthetic to have sort of messier brows. So for example, in Keep's case, I'm going to try to remove not too many of those, as I kind of feel like it's a part of her look. Okay, lastly, I'll bring back the paintbrush to see if we need to smooth out any of this eyeliner over here as well. So once again, I'll sample the eyeliner color, bring that flow back up to 20%, and sort of smooth out the shape of that with careful little strokes. If we need to clean up the bottom edge, we can also sample the skin color from below and clean that up. Here's the before and the after. Now at this point you might be wondering if all these little detail fixes are really worth it, but they definitely add up. especially around the eyes, which are of course the focal point of our portrait. So let's take a look at the before and after of this detail work that we've done around here. Here's the before and here's the after. And as you can see, it has just removed all the distractions and made it so much easier for us to completely focus on the subject's eyes without anything sort of being in the way. So the last thing I like to do is match the catch lights, and I find this to be extremely important for the perceived symmetry of the face and the eyes. I think we actually really underestimate how much of a difference it makes. So in this case, I'm mainly talking about these two very large catch lights. And as you can see, they have slightly different sizes and shapes, even though they're being created by the same light source. So we can either copy this one over here, or we can copy it from the left side to the right side. That's really a totally subjective choice. In this case, I'm going to choose to copy the smaller one so that she doesn't end up looking like an anime character with huge catch lights on both sides. Again, subjective choice. So to do that, I'm going to use the clone stamp tool, and I'm going to try to make sure that I set this new catch light in the same relationship to the iris as it is over here. So I'm actually going to set my sample point at the rightmost point of the pupil. And this also happens to be the intersection of that catch light. Now over here, I'm also going to look for the rightmost point of the pupil, and that's where I will set and anchor my paint point. And since we are working in aligned mode, what we can do is do as many brush strokes as we need and just fill that in. That perfectly copy-pastes that catch light from this side to that side. Let's take a look at the before and after for that, and you'll see why I think this is so important. Here's the before, and here's the after. And even though obviously nothing about her actual eye shape has been changed, this makes her eyes look so much more symmetrical and so much more clean. So now that we've completed the cleanup on the face, I'm going to dedicate a little bit of time to removing some of the more major distractions on the neck. I'll be using a healing brush for this, and it's really important to remember for these areas that this is not the center of attention or the center of focus, so we really only need to remove the most major distractions. We don't need to go as far into detail here as we would on the face. Okay, lastly I want to do some flyaway removal around the hair. Now the way most people like to tackle this, I think, is to use the clone stamp tool, sample from the background, and then paint over the flyaways, and at that point use the eraser or the mask to remove it with a clean edge off of the hair. Personally, this is not my favorite approach, simply because I'm actually kind of a fan of flyaways. I think they look nice and natural, so what I like to do is instead use the healing brush and only remove the outermost and most distracting ones. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and this also offers us a little bit more flexibility when there is a more complex background than this, because in that case the clone stamp method will be a little bit difficult. Meanwhile, removing single hairs is usually still possible. As with the neck, you want to take into consideration that there's not a lot of attention on these flyaways, so this doesn't need to be perfect, especially because a lot of these hairs are already out of focus anyways, so it's really easy to hide little issues. It doesn't need to be perfect. I always like to say, as long as it doesn't attract the viewer's attention, it shouldn't take up too much of our attention. Okay, I'm making a final fix with the clone stamp here, just to diffuse this area a little bit more, and then I think we are all set with our cleanup. Here's the before, and here's the after, and let's zoom in and see that up close. Here's the before, and here's the after. So lastly, I'm going to do any cleanup regarding the crop here. So for example, if I wanted to add on any information outside the current frame, this would be a good time. In this case, I'm just going to clean up some of that negative space around keep and build a bit of symmetry with the crop here. Since our raw import is a smart object, this crop will actually be non-destructive just in case we want any of this information back later. Our objectives for the cleanup were to remove isolated distracting elements and any problematic small texture, and the tools that we used were the healing brush, clone stamp, and the paintbrush. Let's go ahead and move on.